Hi there. We were getting a lot of great questions about assessment, particularly within a French immersion context. So we thought it would be helpful to make a brief video running you through the 4 different purposes of assessment and how they fit within an early literacy program. So first off, it's worth considering, why are we even focused on assessment? Number one, assessment helps us answer questions. It helps us answer questions about individual students and their learning, but it also helps us answer questions about our broader systems and the instruction we're providing. And while assessment does play a really key role in improving student outcomes, the heavy hitter here really is the instruction. Anita Archer puts it so beautifully: the magic is in the instruction. And this old saying puts it a little bit less beautifully, that idea that weighing the pig doesn't make it any fatter. But it's critical to recognize that it really is the instruction that will move the needle for students, but it's the assessment that allows us to provide instruction that is best suited to that child's needs and to improving our systems as a whole to prevent reading problems for a lot of students, as many as possible. So what we'll talk about today is we will chat about the 4 purposes for assessment and where they fit into an early literacy model or program. And we'll also talk about the assessments that are built in within our programming, so you can see where that fits and where you also might need to add in additional assessment. And since I am coming to you from Ontario, I've used, I'll do my best to link these assessment purposes to Assessment 4 as an of learning, which is that link to Ontario's document Growing Success for Assessment, Evaluation, and Reporting. So first off, we'll start with universal screeners, and this is assessment for learning. And you can tell by the name universal, these are assessments we give to every student 3 times per year, and they allow us to know which students are at risk. These are really brief, reliable, and valid assessments. They're really, think about them as highly efficient and very low cost. It's not a huge investment of time, and that's why we're doing it with everybody. Universal assessments give us an indicator of a child's particular skill in relation to a benchmark score. And a benchmark score is not some arbitrary cutoff that we've decided is, what we would want for grade 1 or what we would want for grade 2, but instead it's designed, it's derived from statistics, and it uses predictive probabilities. So for example, if a child met this particular cut score in an Acadience reading assessment, we would know that that child has an 80 to 90% chance of meeting successive reading goals down the road. So it allows us to have a statistical and mathematical idea of which students are on track and which students we would need to think about providing additional support and intervention to allow them to meet that benchmark. You can think about universal screening as a temperature check that you would get at the doctor. If you have a fever, that's a pretty fast, low cost, and really efficient way of noticing if there's a problem. It doesn't tell you what the problem is, though. And that's the reality of universal screeners. They're quite brief, but if we still have questions about a specific child's profile, that would be an indicator that we would need to look for additional tools, which we'll chat about next. You'll notice that there are examples in both French and English. If you're in a French immersion context, EDAPEL really is the best bet, and that is also from Acadience as well. You'll notice as well that some of the most common running record based assessments, whether that's DRA, whether that's PM benchmark, whether that's AlphaJeune or GB+, those are not listed here. Those actually don't serve that same purpose as a universal screener. They're not fast, they're not as reliable and valid, and they don't give us that benchmark cut score using predictive probabilities. So the value of universal screeners, they don't only help us sort out questions and answer questions at an individual student level of helping us to notice which students are at risk, but they also are fantastic for giving us that systems level analysis where we can determine which systems are at risk. So for example, in a response to intervention model, we would want 80% of students to be meeting benchmark criteria on universal screeners. And if we had a large proportion of students that were falling short of that, if we had a case where there were many students who were not meeting that benchmark cut score, that would be an indicator that we would want to look closely and problem solve with what we could be doing or changing at that tier 1 1 classroom level instruction before we start thinking about withdrawal or special education or resource. It really allows us, universal screeners really allow us to have a clear-cut indicator of the health of our tier 1 classroom instruction. So universal screeners are fast and standardized and often timed assessments that we do with everybody. Diagnostic assessments are assessments that we do not do with everybody. Diagnostic assessments, they're not diagnostic in terms of diagnosing a learning exceptionality, but diagnostic in terms of helping a teacher understand and sort out, what do I teach now? What specific skills does this child have? What specific skills does this child need instruction on? These assessments are also assessment for learning. But in this case, they're often untimed informal measures, and we only give diagnostic assessments to students who we still have questions about. So we could also use the simple view of reading to help us guide our strategy here. Let's say we hypothetically have a child who hasn't met benchmark on a universal screener. We would want to dig in to clarify which aspects of reading are still challenging. We know that the end goal is reading comprehension, and we know that comes from a product of skilled word recognition skills as well as adequate language comprehension. So we might want to dig into that word recognition strand and say, okay, we know that this child maybe is not meeting benchmark criteria for an oral reading fluency probe. What is this child's decoding like? We could take it a step further and assess phonics. Does this child have basic or advanced phonics patterns mastered? We could take it a step even deeper and notice, is this child having difficulty with blending or segmenting? What can we know? What do we need to know about phonemic awareness? We could also look into the language comprehension strand. We could check in, does this child have adequate listening comprehension? What's this child's vocabulary like? What's syntax like? What's morphemic awareness like? We could dig a lot into different aspects of literacy development using this simple view to help us guide. And this is something where, we were really mindful of this when we were building an assessment for our programming, and both assessments that are in both of the resources, the tier 1 and the intervention, those are both diagnostic assessments. So our assessments are not screeners. They're not brief, reliable, valid, and they don't give any indicator of who is at risk based on a benchmark cut score. But instead, our assessments allow teachers the opportunity to notice which specific skills does this child have? What specific skills does this child need to be taught? And we notice that there is a fair amount of mixing up of screeners and diagnostic. So for example, the really great reading diagnostic surveys, those would be diagnostic because it gives us a really clear indicator of which specific phonics patterns does a child have, what can they decode and encode with, but that we would not consider that to be a screener. So we've done universal assessment, and let's say there is a child who is not meeting the benchmark there. We've then gone ahead and done some diagnostic assessment to clarify what specific areas are difficult for that child. And then we've used that diagnostic information to help craft a plan for support and intervention. The next step of assessment really would be progress monitoring. And that is another form of assessment for learning. And in this case, progress monitoring allows us to know if our instruction is actually working, or do we need to change course. Now, progress monitoring assessments are very brief indicators, depending on the age of the child, anywhere from 1 to 3 minutes. And those could be given quite frequently, weekly or bi-weekly, very frequently. And that's very purposeful. We know that with a struggling reader, time is not on our side. We really have to hustle if children are going to close the gap. So it's something we can't afford to wait until the end of the school year, or to wait until next term, or to wait until the next benchmark assessment to know whether this instruction is working. We need to know quite quickly, do we need to adjust? You can think about progress monitoring as being really similar to a GPS. We know we've got a target that we want to reach, but are we on track to get there? And are we on track to get there on time? So progress monitoring plays a really key role for the support of any student. And it really does allow us to inform instruction and to inform that intervention. If we're noticing that we're not on track to closing that gap or to meeting that goal, we could go through and consider many other variables and many other questions to help best tailor that support to that child's needs. Could the group be more homogeneous? Could we extend the support? Could we, have that more frequently? What's the match between the support and the homeroom if it's something where that's happening within withdrawal? Can we decrease group size? What can we do to make sure that instruction is enabling that child to meet that goal? And then finally, the last purpose of assessment would be outcome. And this would be assessment of learning. And in this case, we're looking at whether students have actually learned what's planned or what's intended for that grade. Have these students learned and mastered the provincial curriculum expectations? So more an evaluation after. So you can see that these 4 different purposes really do all take on a different role in an early literacy program. It's certainly something where they each serve different purposes, but they are all critical to ensuring that our instruction is ideal to best support student outcomes. So thank you so much for watching this video, and don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions that we can help you with.